Welcome to yet another episode of The Surprise Truth, where a timely insight can change your life forever. I'm very pleased today to bring to you a very famous personality, Satish Mishra, who is an economist and a strategic thinker, and he has been in Indonesia for more than 27 years and has traveled the rest of the world and worked in many countries. And we're going to talk about a very interesting viewpoint of where we are in this world today and what is it that we should be doing through an institute that he has created called the ArthaShastra Institute. So Satish, welcome. Thank you. And great to have you here today. It's an honor for me to be able to have an interaction with you, and I would really welcome the discussion we're going to have today, which might be of some importance to many of our viewers who are in 47 countries, and they'll take some inspiration which will help them in navigating some of these turbulent times that we see ahead of us. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, I'm extremely grateful. This is a great opportunity to actually tell you and tell folks who are watching what we are doing right now, what the future holds for us, and I hope that the example of what we're doing will inspire other younger people in time to come.
Fantastic.
So, thank you very much.
Yeah, so I'm going to actually go straight into something which I believe is very important, and it's an institution that's been created by Satish. It's called the ArthaShastra Institute. It's based in Bali at the moment. Tell me a little bit about why did you want to create an institute especially named this, and what are the key objectives that you look at doing?
Right. Well, first of all, the name.
Yes.
Because that always puzzles people. ArthaShastra actually was the name of a book written by Kautilya Chanakya at the time of Alexander the Great. And it was a time of great turbulence. There were many kingdoms fighting each other. There was tremendous amount of corruption. There was fall in living standards and so on. So out of that chaos, Chanakya wrote this book, basically, which is about governance and statecraft,
Yes.
but in the economic area as well as, and the interesting thing is that he was almost 1500 years ahead of Machiavelli. He had written another book called the Kootaniti, which was really a bit like Machiavelli's Prince. So I thought it was an apt name.
Yeah.
It's also a name recognition both in India and Indonesia, because the name Artha, we all know, refers to finance or economics, and Shastra here is literature, but it can also mean the art of, the science of, and so on. So
Correct.
That's why we chose the name.
Okay. So coming to the key things that you want to pursue through the institute, do you have any specific direction, or is it across the world? How are you seeing as focusing the activities of ArthaShastra?
Well, the two different kinds of focuses, foci. The first is to get us to understand many issues in Indonesia better, because there are gaps in knowledge, just because the speed with which Indonesia has been transformed over the last 20 years. For example, about how the president's office works, why we don't yet have an equivalent of a West Wing in a presidential political system, how decentralization, particularly this big bang decentralization functions, how does our civil service function, and how are many of the economic decisions which affect us, whether it's in regulation, whether it's anti-corruption, etc., are actually, how do they actually function?
Yeah.
And so that's one. But the other side, which is a very important focus, is the relationship between India and Indonesia. And one of the objectives of the ArthaShastra is how to bring them closer together, because for geopolitical reasons, I think that the time has come to do that. And now, why do we create the ArthaShastra? Is not to be a research agency, but a facilitation organization, a way which can link institutions across both these countries, can bring people over from one country to the other, so they can jointly work on particular problems and so on. So, so that is how to bring our two countries closer together, because this is something both sides have been wanting to do for more than 40 odd years and still have not been able to do it, and we thought the ArthaShastra as a catalyst would have an impact, and the time has come to do that.
Yeah. So I have two follow-up questions. It's very interesting what you said about people don't know how the president's office works, how the economy works, and many things. Do you mean that you want to demystify how this works so that it's understood by common people, or are you looking at addressing such issues of knowledge gaps among the educated and the elite? What is your approach?
The first thing is that the common people should understand how the government works and how the economy works and so on. But in a way, that is part of the kind of communication that we are doing now.
Yeah.
Without a significant research base, we simply will get into a lot of gossip and a lot of unsubstantiated opinions. So we would like the common people or the public at large to understand what we're saying. But what we say has to be based on solid evidence and
fact-based.
And fact-based. So that is one thing. And I think the other thing is that if we don't have a research base which is strong, if we have large knowledge gaps, then when other countries do business with us, they don't know how to form their expectations. For example, in the case of India, which has a very well organized civil service, it has all kinds of issues, but we inherited it from the British, and it holds the country together in many ways. If they think when they come here that Indonesia has exactly the same structure, and based on that they have expectations of how certain agreements will be implemented, the speed with which they will be implemented, the way they will be budgeted, and then they are disappointed, is because they have formed the wrong expectations and they don't know enough about Indonesia, and what we want to do is to close some of those gaps.
I think that's an excellent point you make, because there have been many MOUs signed between India and Indonesia in the past, and the reasons why they have not really come to fruition lies in exactly what you mentioned. It's a different operating system. The two operating systems need APIs in between in order to interface.
Totally correct. So I think, and I'll give you an example. I go to India quite often. I've been here long enough. I have lots of friends. Even the impression, the cultural interaction leads to a lot of misunderstanding. I told my friends in Delhi when I was there recently that, the average Indonesian thinks that the Indians who come over talk down to the Indonesians as if they are big brother, and that everything that Indonesia has ever learned comes from them. In the 2,000-year history where we have interacted, it's one-way flow from India to Indonesia. Nobody talks about what has gone back from Indonesia to India.
Yes.
So there is a kind of, arrogance and so-tao or know-all element to some of these, which doesn't go down very well here. So even small things like that can become barriers.
Yes.
And so we want to try and remove those step by step, and ArthaShastra is dedicated to that purpose.
Okay. So I'd come back to this India-Indonesia equation, but I want to bring it context with what's happening in the rest of the world.
Yes.
So geopolitical shifts or shocks happen every few years, and we are probably living through one of them now. And I think some of the questions that are in people's minds is what next? What is the impact? Is this a major change, major shift? May or may not be. But for sure, it is a wake-up call for many people, for many different aspects of it. What are some of the views that you have on the current scenario playing out? And if you could bring a context to how that would impact India and Indonesia, or create a space for India and Indonesia in this entire upset or the shift that's taking place. How do you would like to frame the situation the way it is?
Well, I know you had a reputation for asking easy questions, so I will not. But let me attempt this. This is one of those great biblical questions.
Correct.
Tell us everything you wanted to that you know about the world. But I'll take a crack at it.
Yeah.
I think we have to step back from the US and problems of populism in Europe and so on. The story starts a bit earlier, when we were all debating whether the rise of Asia and rise of some of the other countries in Latin America is a sign of the decline of the West. And the argument was that this is not so much the decline of the West, it's a rise of the rest. And the two countries which were critical to that rise were India and China. Because a century and a half ago, they accounted for more than 55 to 60% of GDP. And the argument was that we were going back to that historical norm, if you like. Right? So the rise of the rest has now created the possibility of many different poles of growth and development and culture, soft power and everything else that you see around the world. And so I think with the issues that have taken place in North America and Europe, we definitely now into a period of a multipolar world. Yeah. And I do not see any way that we will go back to a unipolar world. We will also not go back to sort of duopolar, which we had in the time of the Russia and the US, or the USSR and the US Cold War. Yeah. So we are definitely in a new world of multipolar. Now, multipolar worlds are interesting because they are in, it's not just India on the one hand, China on the other hand in Asia. Other countries then have to also start being part of both these poles. And that means, impact on ASEAN, impact on other countries around and so on. And then the second thing that has to happen is that, the notion we have at the moment because of political and largely economic competition between India and China is that this is how that will be a stressful relationship. But in a multipolar world, I think there is a chance that in the end you will see if there is a pole with India, Indonesia on the one side and countries in ASEAN and China and some of its neighbors on the other side, that you may actually end up having a partnership between these two poles. And then that is the beginning of the Asian century that we're always talking about. So I know it's a long answer, but it was a very difficult question, and that's how I would.
No, I think you put perfect perspective to the whole situation. And this is something that will stand for a long time going forward.
Of course.
And it's interesting you mentioned that in a multipolar world there will be many poles, and it would create a very interesting equation for countries to not have to take certain decisions,
yes,
therefore allowing a lot more sovereign independence.
Yes.
So I agree fully with you that it's very interesting times ahead. So I would go a little bit into, okay, if you see the whole world as we pan out and then we come to our side of the world, we live in ASEAN as a region. And I think ASEAN is also one of those issues of an untold story with a huge amount of potential. And I know you've done a lot of work on ASEAN. However, I'll ask you something very specific about ASEAN, which I believe our viewers would want to know, the surprise truth about ASEAN, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. What could be some of the hidden benefits or hidden strengths, or you could say hidden opportunities that ASEAN presents, which may be even more accentuated now with the way the world is changing into a multipolar world?
Yeah, I think it's easy, in a way, when you stand outside, to see ASEAN as not a very decisive kind of organization, because any group of countries which uses consensus as a basis of decision making cannot move very fast. That's as true of countries as organizations. You just take NATO as an example, you take the European Union as an example, and so on. So it's easy from outside, especially when the secretariat is not, it's more a sort of organizing committee and a coordinating group, as opposed to the European Union, which also has regulatory powers and financing and so on and so on. So it's easy to see this as a weak alliance of different countries, especially because it's more varied than the EU. If you actually see the
composition,
it's more varied. Now, if you see it that way, you need to ask two questions. One is, in a region which has been devastated by Cold War, Vietnam certainly, Kampuchea certainly, and in the mid-60s, Indonesia certainly, and so on and so on. How is it that these group of people, these countries, have managed not to go to war with each other, have managed to cooperate in a whole area of economic and organizational protocols, and are still done extremely well in terms of the economic development? You know, these were the miracle countries, if you like. So I think you need to get past the impression and start looking at the ground reality. And two things stand out. One is that the growth of human capital, which everybody talks about. And the second is this whole issue of being able to move from civil wars and major disasters to modern economies, which are, you know, all of them are growing reasonably well. Of course, many of them still have problems and political instability, but the trend is very clear. And so, you know, people have to answer that kind of question rather than simply from the top saying, yeah, well, you know, looking at the secretariat or looking at the fact they don't criticize each other more than they should, etc. So I think that is the resilience is the great.
So do you see there's economic opportunity for industry to be making use of the ASEAN structure? Let's say in the world of trade, in the world of manufacturing, where the market is presented as a, you know, the 10 countries.
Yes.
And the proximity of each of them makes logistics easier, etc. Do you see that kind of alliance working out?
Well, I think it's already working out. It's already working out. There is, you know, if you take maritime trade and so on, that's already working out. But the other big thing with ASEAN can bring is this free flow of labor, you know. So because demography is different in different countries, the amount of skilled labor is different. I mean, some countries, for instance, Cambodia, virtually historically destroyed their university system. They're very short of skilled labor. And unless you have a protocol which allows skilled labor from other countries to fill that gap, then, you know, despite resources, countries like Cambodia, which are come out of very, very internecine kind of war, you know, are hamstrung. So I think that is a very big thing. And of course, the financial system also. You know, you have one or two world-class financial systems, you know, in Singapore, in Malaysia, and over time, I suspect even in Indonesia and so on. And those are very difficult things to organize, you know. And ASEAN has a basic structure than the industry and others can.
So it has lots to offer. In fact, one of the surprise truths about the ASEAN region is the fact that 10% of the world live in ASEAN. It's a 700 plus million population. However, it only contributes to 2 to 3% of the GDP of the world. So there is an opportunity to, you know, increase 6 to 7% of the GDP share if it gets some of the things right in terms of what's the opportunity ASEAN can offer to the rest of the world. Not just that, but also within ASEAN. I think there are a lot of opportunities for the countries to collaborate within ASEAN.
But can I mention one other surprising truth?
Please.
Which we never think about, but it's the numbers bear that out. That if you look at the largest number of women-owned or operated small firms in the world, the majority lie in this region. Yes. Which is very, you know, you wouldn't think about it, but it's because of the vast increase in female labor employment in the urban areas, the move from the villages to textile firms and others in the cities. And now those firms, you know, are now clients for new fintech and other kinds of initiatives. So I think this also is a real surprise truth, and and shows again the resilience that the region shows.
Okay, we're going to explore a little bit about the relationship between India and Indonesia, as you may call it, the India-Indonesia axis, and understand some surprise truths that may not be easily known to most of you. And I have Satish here, who has a lot of experience between his various roles across the world, which has been brought together in the better understanding of India and Indonesia, which is exactly what ArthaShastra Institute intends to do. So Satish, a few insights from you or surprise truths about India and Indonesia.
Well, I don't know where to start. There are so many surprise truths when we actually look at more deeply into them. But the first one, which was a huge surprise to me, and then subsequently surprised everybody else in conversations like this, was exactly how little we here in Indonesia know about India. And what is worse, given all the human capital and so on that India has, of how little India knows about Indonesia. You know, you'll be hard put to get many people in India who can identify, you know, 2 or 3 of the provinces in Indonesia, any of its political leaders, name 2 or 3 of his large companies, you know, even the number of islands, and so on, and house. So all these basic things, completely unknown, even to the most senior people that you talk to, you know.
Yeah.
So that's one. The second one, which is also very unusual, is that they all say that, you know, Indonesia is a country that we have always wanted to be close to for cultural, linguistic, other reasons, going before the Bandung conference, you know, because of this relationship between Nehru and Sukarno and all the rest of it. Now, we are talking about the mid-40s here, you know, or the end of the 40s. So 75 years. Apparently, the Indians say, this is a country we should naturally be close to. And the people here are also saying the same thing. But somehow we've never got there. It's like there is a force field which is separating these. Yeah. And one of the reasons is, again, simply a lack of knowledge, because in India, as far as I know, you will be hard to find a single university, research institute, think tank, which focuses on Indonesia. Usually Indonesia is wrapped in some, you know, Asia-Pacific studies or international studies, and a couple of lectures, a couple of people. So for a country this size, and then, you know, you try and find a single institution in Indonesia which is dedicated to the study of India, and you won't find that. So clearly, you know, in the public conversation, in recruitment in government, in recruitment in companies, you don't have a cohort of people who actually know much about it and have a systematic way of furthering that knowledge. So that came as one very big surprise. And one of the results was now that in the ArthaShastra we are actually promoting a consortium of at least 10 Indian universities, think tanks of repute, and linking them with similar institutions in Indonesia, and helping them define their research agenda, creating joint study groups. So we start closing some of these gaps, you know, so that when the government here wants to go, let's say, to Delhi, they have a group of people, they have a knowledge bank which they can draw on to prepare for those things. You know.
Correct. So is this actually the case with, let's say, some of the other countries like in the US and Europe? Do they have Indonesia studies in the university?
I think in there they do have dedicated programs on Indonesia. They may not be called Indonesian studies, but within the South Asia or the international studies, they will actually do courses
they do have
on Indonesia.
And that's missing from the India-Indonesia academic circles?
Yes, totally.
Understood.
Totally.
So it's something that can be easily implemented if you were to put a program together?
Completely implemented. But the other side of it is, Sachin, also that, you know, we are used to, when we talk about knowledge, we're used to, you know, 400-page books and getting down to the minutiae of history or culture
digest,
or technical diagrams, whatever it is. What is needed here is a linking mechanism.
Okay.
We have a lot of that kind of knowledge in different ways scattered all over the place. Our job in the ArthaShastra is to actually show that there is a lot of information there, and how it can actually be connected, and how we can help political decisions on the one hand and business decisions on another, you know. So actually there's a flow of information between these two countries, and then that also then promotes a flow of people. It makes us more familiar with each other in terms of our business and so on. For example, most businesses in India who I know who have come here, and they may be global businesses or they may be large businesses in India, but not quite yet global, come to Indonesia and simply roll out a large set of numbers on costs and returns, etc., etc. But they have no idea who they're actually pitching this to. You know, and because again the basic information about how business is structured here is missing, and that has led to a lot of misunderstanding, etc. So whether it is in business and politics, certainly a lot of agreements were sort of supposedly made, but then when you come back to both parties, who do you actually give it to to follow that through? That is not understood by the either side. So so we may think, well, it'll take 1 month, but 5 months later it's still lying on somebody's desk, you know. And ArthaShastra can actually point to those blocks and say, look, this is the problem, this is why it's not moving forward. So don't get disappointed with the whole country because your structure is not exactly the same.
No, you're absolutely right. You know, Satish, there needs to be a protagonist who can follow up on these and make use of that opportunities and convert them into reality. In particular about the MOUs that you mentioned, I am aware that there are few initiatives which is trying to encapsulate the spirit of those MOUs and translate that into action. And the Indian Embassy is also involved in that, so is the Ministry of Investment. Why I mentioned this is because I have not seen this before.
Yes.
They are going to create a India Technology Zone or a India Tech Zone, which will allow 30 or 40 Indian companies to promote their technology to the industry of Indonesia to help the industrialization process. They're going to be a special economic zone, and in fact BKPM or the Ministry of Industry wants to open an India desk.
Yes.
And the India desk is especially meant to fast track and facilitate investment from India, which in my opinion within 3 months of that visit, if if Indonesian side and the Indian side are working together to create these kind of frameworks, is very positive. I haven't seen that. I've been here 27 years and I've never seen follow-up happening actually. So to your point, actually ArthaShastra Institute comes and adds on many other things that may be missing, and therefore creates these channels of how actionable initiatives can take place.
No, I think it's a great initiative. The trouble, Sachin, is that nobody in India knows about it.
Exactly.
Right. And the Indians have taken a lot of initiatives, you know, sending business forums and so on here, and then it goes back and, you know, just stays there. So I think this is a great initiative, and I know the ambassador has been especially very supportive and so on, and I think he's, you know, a remarkable man, and you know, we should support him. I think the one thing that is also difficult is that if you go to Delhi and start talking about Indonesia, the first thing they say is, but you know, Indonesia is already Chinese. In those words, Indonesia is already Chinese. You know, so you know, what can we really do? And that's a genuine question, because so many senior people ask that question. And my reply has always been that, you know, you need to get out of this paranoia in a way, and you need to think about exactly what the Chinese presence is in Indonesia. Most of the Chinese here are actually Indonesians. You know, second, third generation. There is a huge income difference between a few large conglomerates at the top and all the other Chinese that you see running cafes and restaurants around the country, and so on. But the big difference is that Indonesia historically has not had any large cities. You know, I mean, we have had the old Agra and Delhi, and in the south Hyderabad, and so many centers of urban existence, which has then attracted artisans and industries of different kinds, and architects and marble cutters, and you name it, right? So there's already been a lot of secondary industry in India going back to hundreds of years. Now Indonesia hasn't had that. So what you have here is you have the traders at the top, many of whom are of Chinese origin but Indonesian, and they left China in the Cold War process because of communist China and so on and so on, and they were successful here, but they're still largely traders. You know, or people who are in assembly. Everybody else is at the bottom. It's your family size, mostly family firms, which in India will be considered micro firms. Here, they're considered small firms, but we hardly have any medium sized firms. And if you don't have that, how do you create a domestic pre-booming business community which can grow from, which has a growth path, which at some point can leverage finance and leverage skills and etc. And that is where our India-Indonesia partnership becomes so critical, because in India what they have is a whole series of firms, middle-sized firms, which are in pharma, which are in R&D, which are in education, which are in health, which are in infrastructure, which are in agriculture, which can connect with our smaller firms here. And before you know it, you actually can get a class of middle-sized Indonesian firms which are on this growth path. The last part of the answer is, which is also a first, that for the first time, as I can see, Indonesia actually has a very fast developing integrated domestic market. And there are two aspects to that. One is through connectivity. So for the first time, Sumatra, Java, Bali, and a range of others are being connected in a broader aspiration to be a maritime state, where you actually start connecting the different islands and so on. But also Indonesia has had record urbanization. These young people have been moving to the cities, a lot of new cities have been created. And so out of a population of close to 280 million, over 55% people live in cities.
Yes, urban areas.
Yeah, and they have a per capita consumption of over $3,000, which definitely puts them even in an international middle class. So smaller companies here, for the first time, can actually produce for the domestic market. For small companies, it's very difficult to access export markets and so on. But now they can access domestic market. That plus the downstreaming and everything else which the government is now trying to do creates this opportunity to have a producing, manufacturing group of people. And that is the counterweight, if you like, if you're so obsessed about the Chinese economic influence, then you won't be so scared of it. And then you can imagine a world where there will be a partnership with the Indian firms, with the Chinese firms, with other firms across the world. And Indonesia as a middle power and a fast-growing middle power, can grow into its own place in the world. And I think that's the way I see this.
Okay, so if industrialization becomes important, there is a big role for India there, because I think there is a story in India of how India has become an industrial nation, which is also a recent story if you were to look at. Do you see that there are certain sectors that we should focus on between India and Indonesia more than some of the others?
Yes, but before I answer that, the story is also not only about industry. Now the story is also about certain kind of services, whether it is in education, of skills.
Skills, okay.
In India is fast appearing to be the human capital of the world. They want to be outgoing to do that. So our advantage is that we can actually partner in areas of industry, which then brings with it the skills and so on that India also has a surplus of. It's not like they are hiring American engineers to work in their middle industry and those are the people who get transferred here. Right? So I think the two go together in this case, in the Indian connection. As far as industry is concerned, one is clearly in the health, education, infrastructure kind of sector, because all of them have both the government facilitation side and the private sector investment side, just because they are public goods, right?
Correct.
The other side is, of course, in research and development, particularly AI, in ICT and so on, which India is extremely famous for, and which are very fast moving technologies. So we need to get there early, and it is much easier to do it with India than to now in this uncertain world try to negotiate deals with other places, right? And the third area, which I think we do need to work together very closely, is in areas of climate change. India is definitely suffered a lot in this case. Indonesia has one of the largest biodiversity, if not the largest, in the world. And again, many kinds of technologies in energy, in carbon capture and others, are the ones where they are new, they're virgin, basically greenfield technologies, but where the interests of both countries are served, as well as, of course, creating employment and all the things that we talked about.
So in this, what would be the role of ArthaShastra Institute? How do you see your organization facilitating this?
Well, one is we can actually do exactly what I'm doing now, is identify areas where the needs of Indonesia and the needs of India actually connect. And not many people are working on identifying those complementarities and so on. The second thing is to actually identify institutions or companies or technologies which can actually serve that kind of need. So putting this together, helping develop strategies of how these groups can actually connect, what are how long it will take, what is the cost overrun if likely, etc. So we can be involved in that kind of exercise. And the other thing that we can do is also link with many of the organizations globally, bring this experiment to a wider world, by linking to many of the top think tanks in the world, whether it is Carnegie, whether it is McKinsey, whether it is Brookings, and so on and so on. Because we hope to have representatives outside this region also. And so I think that's a good beginning, really.
So some of the things that you had mentioned obviously indicates that we must send people across from here to there and there to here. It could be student exchange, researchers, scientists, innovators, etc., which is, I think, the only way people will start to get to know each other and start working with each other. But one of the outcomes of COVID was that we learned to live in a hybrid world.
Correct.
Do you see that we should continue, because of cost efficiency reasons and also time availability, to create like a digital interface or interchange between the two countries so that we can do more work hybrid and digitally? Do you think that would work, or do you think we should still go back to pre-COVID days?
Well, that's a great question. And I suppose there's not a very clear answer, but I'll give you what I think. I think one is that one of the problems with simply sending people to the other country, is that they start learning once they arrive there, even where they fit into the system, what kind of research, whether they click with their colleagues, etc. So much of that preparatory work can be done by digital means. In ArthaShastra, what we have agreed to do, as I say, we are creating this consortium of university think tanks, is to actually produce 10-page, 15-page concept notes, research concept notes with clear questions, and then see who are the people working on them, and then have a number of digital exchanges in terms of their approach to that research, the kind of problems they face, their past experience, etc. And once they're ready, then actually have this exchange that you're talking about. So they actually go into a familiar surroundings. And I think that would work. So, that kind of approach, which is hybrid, is pretty effective,
Okay. So, I'm getting a pretty good idea now of actually how you're planning to, frame the activities of ArthaShastra Institute. And it's very interesting because it leaves a lot of opportunity for many of you from the viewers who want to interact with Satish and the Institute to see how you can, play a role or be a part of that puzzle that actually puts this whole relationship together. Some of the issues that have always been on my mind are, what's the low-hanging fruit that we can go after? Because if you really look at a blueprint, there are like maybe 100 things to do. But if you were to pick and choose the top 3 things that you would focus on in the first 1 year, what would they be?
Well, I think the first one is simply the issue of culture and history and familiarity with each other. You know, so far the impression is always, as I was saying earlier, that everything that Indonesia has got comes from India, and there's not much that has gone from this side to there. So the first thing, I think we need to
Dispel that.
And the way we do that is also to, first of all, see what India was when all these influences were at their peak. You know, after all, there was no India of the kind that we're talking about today. We had the Chola Empire, and then we had contacts with Odisha, and you know, we had Bali Yatras and all kinds of stuff. But there wasn't in India, and there wasn't in Indonesia also. You know, so we're looking at specific island shifts and so on. And there is even much harder to argue that an island of Java and province of India, Odisha, whatever, that somehow there was a one-way link. Okay, so we cannot go to this macro picture because India now has, you know, 1.4 billion people and we've got 280 odd million, so not billion, million people, and we've got 280 odd million, and we are, you know, trying to think how to interact. We can't go from that situation to where, you know, two small or relatively small areas of the world are interacting with each other. So
Correct.
automatically there will be a two-way interaction.
Yes.
So one is to close, you know, dispel that impression. And I think there's a huge amount of work to be done here.
Yeah.
The second big priority will be in terms of basic assumptions we had about each other. You know, for instance, even the most senior Indonesians do not know how decentralized Indonesia really is. You know, so the second priority is to work on areas where the knowledge gap directly impedes on policy making. Yeah. So the president's office, the regulatory chain, the institutions that exist here, etc. And in that context, we would also emphasize Indonesia's journey over the last 20 years. You know, one of the things that we have to be able to do is to spend a fair amount of energy showing what a miracle it is to have Indonesia as it has developed today. Right? Here is a country, in a way, which is just too good to be true. You know, 40 odd years of military rule, very centralized government, yeah, suddenly turns around and becomes a multi-party democracy. It doesn't have strident Islam, it doesn't fragment into different Islamic groups killing each other, as even happens in Afghanistan and Pakistan and certainly in Iraq and so many other places. It has not happened here. Right? Its economic recovery has been dramatic. In the, you know, the output fall in the time of Chris Mon was from a 7% trend to 13% drop. That's a more than 21% drop in 1 year. Much bigger than the USSR ever had, right? And then you have the picture of the IMF, you know, with Kam Desu standing over Suharto like that, which of course no Indonesian has ever forgotten. And then what happens? Within 5 years, the IMF is asked to leave, the economy starts to recover, right? The bank restructuring, even though super expensive, holds the country together.
It's a remarkable story.
Right? And the growth rate is now, you know, 5.5%, whatever, low inflation rates, kept its capital markets open in all of this story. So what you have an Islamic democracy, you have one which didn't go the route of the Arab Spring countries and so on, where the military has actually gone back to the barracks. And even though presidents are ex-military generals, they've not openly formed parties which support the military. You've got a very young population, you know, again, which is moving around because of this new infrastructure, right? So, and there is and Indonesia doesn't have enemies. You know, it doesn't really have any enemies. You can't see anything in the next 15, 20 years which will derail this situation. So this is a remarkable story, you know. If you really wanted to have a development miracle, you could focus on economic growth and low inequality, which we used to do. But now it's so much more than that, And that story needs to be told, that Indonesia
Correct.
is a power on its own that needs to be reckoned with, and you have to partner with it, with respect, with intelligence, with knowledge, with enthusiasm, and so on and so on. So that is the spirit that the ArthaShastra wants to bring to this discussion.
Okay.
But you asked about priorities, And clearly there are three sets of priorities. One is at the policy level itself, because that then filters down to the whole government machinery, this sense of optimism across the two countries, and a lot of that based on ignorance and so on. But that has to be in business. One of the biggest problems is that our firms come and they are so confident because they're a global name, they think everybody in Indonesia knows about it. I remember having a discussion with the Tatas, with Prasad Menon, who at that time was head of Tata Power. And the approach was very simple. We are Tatas. We don't pay bribes. We have got our, we are very productive. We can, our prices are very competitive, etc., etc. And so I asked him, ask anybody in the street here, who is Tata? And they will say it's a construction firm because they have just, and it's got nothing to do with what you guys are talking about, right? Godrej, many other companies like that. Because they're well known in India, they think everybody, their household names in Indonesia is not true.
Correct.
So that's another area of just being able to see what can usefully link with, what kind of associations. So that's another, and helping them do that, not only talk about it, but actually, if for instance, let's take the case of the blue economy. Indonesia has the largest fisheries reserve in the world and aspires to be a maritime state. Now, that opens up lots of opportunities. There are many people in India say, well, our coastline, if you were to stretch it out, would be a huge, So we're also a blue economy, actually.
Yes.
So this is something that ArthaShastra can pick up and then see how some of the leading entrepreneurs in this area can connect together. So it's all about moving the ball, and not getting tied down with old prejudices or tied down with supposed barriers which really don't exist so much.
So a lot of surprise truths there, Satish. I think, you've opened the eyes and the minds of people who are following this podcast. And one particular thing struck me was how you brought about this whole idea of the ethnic diversity of India and the ethnic diversity of Indonesia may have a connection, with the Odisha example, for example. And we know other communities are there, the Tamil communities, for example, in Medan versus in Tamil Nadu, etc., etc., and the Gujarati communities. We always tend to look at India as an entirety and Indonesia as an entirety, when actually it is a addition, a sum of very many different factors.
Good point.
And 30 over states in India and 30 over provinces in Indonesia. There's a lot to actually work on, and I think that's the opportunity of trying to figure out what are those connect points. It may not be India, Indonesia, it actually might be within this definition of India and definition of Indonesia, where you might find different connect points. Culturally, there may be something else, business, there may be something else. It's an interesting thing to think about. In fact, that's one of my takeaways from the discussion with Satish, that we must explore this idea a lot more.
Well, can I add one thing?
Please.
Can I add one thing? Decentralization in Indonesia is a unique thing. I've never seen decentralization with the speed and the scale that Indonesia has done. Now, of course, you can keep criticizing and say, well, the district governments are not so strong, they're still dependent on the central government, etc. But what is happening is that you have a decision-making machinery which goes down to small districts. Right? Now, what is the opportunity is what we're getting at. And the opportunity is that in Indonesia, if you have a new technology, if you have a new kind of investment, new initiative, it's the only country that I know where you could start with 10 districts today and grow to 100 districts in 5 years' time. That scale-up possibility. And in many countries, the scale is important. That's what your profits depend on.
It's a scale model.
Digital energy, so many places, right? Even in areas like shipping and ports and this and that. So, if many of the Indian companies came here and they say, okay, we want to do something in Eastern Indonesia, we will do a trial pilot scheme in a few of the islands in Eastern Indonesia, maybe using Bali as a hub. That is, if successful, likely to grow into a very large business in Indonesia. And that's something that I can't see happening anywhere else in the world, but it can happen here.
Okay. So I'm going to try and wrap up a few of these ideas that you put in my head now, actually, and I hope in the viewers' minds as well, and go a little bit into understanding Satish Mishra as a person, and what has kept you in Indonesia, and what are some of the things that you like to do which makes you a very successful economist and a strategic thinker?
One thing is that I always felt from college, and I was privileged to have an Oxbridge education, all the rest of it, and it's easy then to go into academia and and write all your books, etc. But I felt that if you really want to understand change, you have to go where the change is taking place. There are not many good books about it. So I left several permanent jobs in my career, and I went off to Africa in the middle of civil wars, etc., to see how countries which are destroyed by war or conflict and so on can be put back together again.
And be in the middle of the action.
And be in the middle of the action, because to know how decisions actually made, and everybody makes decisions under uncertainty. But some people do it much better than others for many reasons. So what are some of those reasons? So I left a job at the UN, I've left a job at the OECD, many other places where it's a very happy existence, you have good employers, you have no financial tension, and you have great respect. So I've been a risk taker in that sense, because I just didn't feel that there were enough academic material that would satisfy your curiosity.
Correct.
And one of those biggest things was what happens when systemic collapses take place. And by systemic, I mean that it's not one economic sector, it's not your agricultural sector or your aerospace sector or whatever. But if it's every single administrative mechanism in the country collapses. It's what happens after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's what happens after the fall of the Shah of Iran. What happens after the Bolshevik Revolution, if you want to go back in history, or what happens after the fall of Suharto. Everything is up for grabs, every single thing. And by definition, you don't have many books, because these things happen once in a lifetime.
Yes.
So once they happen once in a lifetime, and if you're not there, you won't understand it.
Correct.
In the same way that if we talk to Indonesians today, one of the things that the younger people, if you talk to them, it's impossible to understand the scale of the issues all emerging at the same time that President Habibie had to deal with when he was in office. And imagine the kind of risk you had to take to make sure that the military stays out of politics, on the one hand. On the other, the aspirations of the ordinary people don't end up in street brawls and so on, like in Egypt and elsewhere, right? And out of that, to go for a democratic system, to be able to create this economic recovery, where would you see that if you're not there? And I was very privileged because President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono was somebody that I'd worked with for a while. A large number of ministers here are people who discussed with me and my colleagues some of the dilemmas that they were facing. And so, that's worth its weight in gold. And I'm very grateful to Indonesia. I'm very grateful to my friends here. And that's one of the reasons I gave up a British citizenship to become an Indonesian. And all my friends are saying, well, you're crazy. But I'm perfectly at ease. And I think ArthaShastra gives me an opportunity to contribute, pay something back. It's been fulfilling intellectually.
Yeah.
is certainly fulfilling in terms of my own inner peace and
Sure.
personality, and I hope to, carry on.
Yeah. So you must have been a mentor to a lot of people on your journey here, but who are the people who may have mentored you or inspired you over the years?
Well, oh God, this is, as you get older, there are many, many mentors that you come across. My earliest, I suppose, was in school. I had a headmaster called Wilshire. When I went to the UK at the age of 10, the first day I was actually caned because it was so cold and I was late for class. And Wilshire was a very interesting guy, and the UK schooling system was that you took an aptitude test, and if you were in the top 20%, you went to grammar schools. If you were in the bottom 80, you went to secondary modern schools and left school at the age of 15. So I failed all my exams. I was at the bottom. And Wilshire, the headmaster, who at that time was a Labour Party supporter, didn't believe in all these differentiations, basically encouraged me to continue. I was the only non-white in a school of 700. And so he was a great inspiration to me, and basically said that, you have to compete and do the best and so on. And I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to Oxford and then eventually do a PhD at Cambridge and all the rest of it. It's all because of the encouragement that Wilshire gave.
Yes.
When I was in university, I also met Amya Kumar Bagchi, who was a famous Bengali professor, very left-wing, who was a fellow of Jesus College. And I asked him to be my PhD supervisor. He said, yeah, but you don't know anything about India, you're brought up in the UK, etc. So I went to him and I said, well, I'm coming to India with you. And he was shocked, and he said, well, he was moving back to Calcutta. He brought me to Calcutta. And to cut a long story short, I left a fancy flat in Cambridge and went and shared a room for 3 years in the ANCNI Institute in Patna. And then I taught at Presidency College, Calcutta. So Bagchi and some of his friends, even though we disagreed on a whole series of things, especially politics, ended up being as a personal example
Yes.
of somebody who'd given up a lot and had a very Victorian work ethic and so on. Was the second inspiration. And then in Indonesia, there are so many people who inspired me. I remember Billy Yodono, who used to be the ambassador of Indonesia in France. And Billy and I became good friends. And every time I had something which totally puzzled me, I'd go to Billy, who was then heading the State Audit Commission. And I'd go to his office, and he had a huge office, but with no papers. So I sit down and I asked Billy, I said, Billy, how come you have no papers here? He said, that's the part of the job, is to actually have the papers come to me, because before that didn't happen very much. Right? So Billy was a mentor in a way. I learned so many things about Indonesia, and culturally, I'll give you an example, very small example, but it will show the kind of how much learning there is to be done here. You go to senior meetings here, and immediately the food and the tea and the coffee all comes out. I've hardly ever seen anybody drink the coffee. In India, when you go and they will say, oh, the coffee is getting cold, and they will suddenly start drinking and so on. Here, nobody drinks, nobody touches anything until the meeting is to finish. And then they will say, oh, please have some coffee. And then people, please have some tea. And people will gulp some tea and push off, right? So all kinds of small things I learned in that way, and many, many stories from Billy. Joyo Vinoto was another friend who, worked through his, he had a think tank in Brighton where SBA also used to go very often with his family and so on. So he was another inspiration, it's just to welcome me.
Yeah.
I'm here, I've given up a big fancy job in Paris, I moved to Jakarta with a big salary cut and with a very complicated agenda of work. And people reached out to me, and so I have I mean, my gratitude to Indonesia is eternal. I mean, you know, I've so much I've learned here. So.
Well, now you're based in Bali, and I believe you travel quite often to the other parts of Indonesia, especially Jakarta.
Yes.
So we'll get to see more of Satish as he runs the activities of ArthaShastra Institute. But I would encourage all of you to, you know, get in touch. You can find it easily on the website. Their website can be found, and you can interact with Satish and be involved in the story about how India and Indonesia would evolve into an alliance which will really give a place to both the countries in this new global order. So with that,
Can I just
please?
Sorry.
Yes. The last word.
Yeah, last word. I mean, this is the ArthaShastra Institute is essentially almost kind of a mini movement, if you like. You know, it welcomes people to come and join us. We have study groups. We will have other opportunities to welcome your knowledge and participation, and criticize us, you know, be rude to us, but be open with us and open into something that the ArthaShastra dialogue that we have created. And I'm very grateful to Sachin to give me an opportunity to talk about it. I think this is the beginning, and I hope this is another kind of learning that we're all collectively going to be engaged in. And so thank you very much, Sachin. I cannot, this has been a wonderful occasion.
Thank you, Satish. And to all our viewers, The Surprise Truth always aims to bring you very eminent personalities who are strategic thinkers, and Satish has delivered absolutely on the dot. It's a very revealing episode. In fact, it's opened my eyes and given me a lot of things. And you know, the tagline of this podcast is that an insight can be, a timely insight can change your life forever. I think this is one of those episodes, and I hope it will do the same for you. We look forward to catching up more with you on other episodes, but do give your reactions and your comments in the comment section of the YouTube channel here, and we look forward to interacting with you as we go along in this journey between India and Indonesia, developing into a fruitful and you would say a relationship that has an outcome that we so long have been desiring to put together. Thank you very much.